or we can cultivate joy-producing unity in our church family, first of all, by celebrating shared experiences together, but then secondly, by submitting to one another. Paul writes, do nothing out of selfish desire, selfish ambition, or vain conceit, the NIV says. Rather, in humility, value others above yourselves, not looking to your own interests, but each of you look to the interests of others. So we need to make choices regarding our relationships with each other. And the choices are threefold. First of all, we choose to do nothing out of selfish ambition. Secondly, we choose to humbly value others above ourselves. And thirdly, we choose to put the best interests of others before ours. I mentioned that while we were on vacation, Carol and I spent some time in Virginia. And so while we were in the Shenandoah area, close to Thomas Jefferson's Monticello and James Madison's Montpelier, we visited both of those places. And we heard the stories of two founding fathers, two presidents, and the inconsistency between their belief that all men are created equal and their practice as slave owners. And it bothered them. This incongruity bothered them. And they felt like that in time they would do something about it. In reading a history of slavery in Virginia from 1772 to 1832, titled The Internal Enemy, we discovered that many leading Virginia slave owners, including Jefferson and Madison, agreed in theory that enslaved Africans should be emancipated. But they came to accept, perpetuate, and justify slavery as essential and immutable because they determined not to look out for the best interests of their slaves, but to look out for their own economic interests and the interests of their heirs, not the interests of the enslaved. Do you realize what it would have cost them to free their slaves? At Montpelier itself, in terms of James Madison's, there were 320 people that lived on that 2,600-acre estate. 20 of them were free men and women who were served by the 300. And if they were going to free the 300, there was no way they could manage the 2,600 acres. They would go bankrupt. And so it was in their best interest to keep their slaves. James Madison wanted to emancipate his slaves. He was expected to emancipate his slaves. The Frenchman, friend of our founding fathers, friend of our early presidents, Lafayette, sat at the dining room table with James Madison and said to him, "When will you do right? When will you right this inequity?" And it was believed that in his last will and testament, he would accomplish this purpose. He would free his slaves. But in fact, he couldn't afford to. His economic interests and the interest of his heirs came first in his will and testament, and he deeded all of his inheritance to his wife Dolly. And then Dolly was left to sell the slaves in order to pay creditors, and ended up selling the whole estate in 1844. You see, it would have been costly. Personally, it would have been costly for them to pay the price to set their slaves free. Interesting that we have a Savior who was willing to pay the price to set us free. And not us only, but men and women of every ethnic group, every nation, tongue, tribe, and people.